They took my left eye first, though I didn't understand what that meant at the time. I remember the cold of the augmetic scanner passing over my face, the way the tech priest's mechadendrites clicked and whirred in what might have been approval, or perhaps just automatic function. I never learned to tell the difference. The smell of sacred oils mixed with something else, something organic and rotting that I couldn't identify then, but which would become as familiar to me as my own breath, or what passed for breath after they replaced my lungs. I was nobody. That's important to understand. I wasn't a heretic or a criminal deserving punishment, wasn't a volunteer seeking the Omnissiah's blessing, wasn't even particularly notable among the underhive masses of Factorum Septimus. I was a hab block maintenance worker, third shift, responsible for keeping the moisture recyclers functioning in residential section 447 Gamma. My name was Talvin Cross. I had a wife once, before the Factorum collapse took her. I had a routine. I had a life measured in small comforts, a hot cup of recaf before shift, the sound of the evening hymnal broadcast, the weight of exhaustion that meant another day survived. The Mechanicus doesn't care about any of that. They don't explain why you're chosen. One moment I was reporting a malfunction in Recycler Unit 73, and the next there were servitors flanking me, their dead eyes staring through me, and a tech adept was scanning me with instruments I couldn't name. I remember asking what I'd done wrong. The tech adept, I never learned its name, never saw its face behind the rebreather mask, and the forest of sensor augmetics, didn't answer. It just made a notation on its data slate with a manipulator arm, and the servitors took me. The facility was 3 levels below the Factorum floor, in spaces I'd never known existed despite 15 years working the sector. The walls were gunmetal, grey and lined with cables thick as my arm, pulsing with data light that hurt to look at directly. The temperature was precisely controlled. I learned later that temperature variance affects experimental outcomes, cold enough that I could see my breath, but not so cold that I shivered. The Mechanicus doesn't tolerate inefficiency, and shivering wastes energy. Everything smelled of machine oil and ozone, and underneath it all, that organic decay smell that I would come to know as the scent of failed augmentation, of flesh that hadn't taken to the blessed machine, of discarded subjects whose bodies had rejected the Omnissiah's gifts. There were others. 17 of us in the initial processing chamber, stripped of our clothes and our dignity, standing in a line while robed figures moved among us with Auspex scanners and data gatherers. The woman next to me was crying silently, tears running down her face while she stared straight ahead. The man on my other side had his eyes closed, lips moving in prayer to the Emperor. I wanted to pray too, but the words wouldn't come. My mind felt blank, wiped clean by pure incomprehension. This couldn't be happening. There had been no trial, no accusation, no explanation. The Imperium doesn't work this way, I told myself. There must be some mistake. But the Mechanicus doesn't make mistakes. They make calculations. The first procedure lasted 6 hours. They strapped me to a surgical frame that adjusted itself constantly, servos whining as it compensated for every involuntary muscle twitch. The restraints were warm, heated by the bodies of however many subjects had occupied this frame before me. A tech priest whose robes were stained with old lubricant and something darker stood over me, its face hidden behind a bronze mask worked with circuit patterns. It spoke in binaric cant to its assistants, the clicks and chirps washing over me meaninglessly while I stared up at the ceiling. The ceiling was riveted metal, each rivet head perfectly aligned. I counted them, 243 visible from my position. I counted them again to be sure. 243. They didn't use anesthetic. I learned later that pain response is valuable data, that the subject's reactions to augmentation inform success rates and compatibility indices. But in that moment, when the first incision opened my skull, and I felt the pressure of instruments entering my brain tissue, I didn't know I was providing data. I just screamed. The sound echoed in the surgical chamber, bouncing off those perfectly aligned rivets, mixing with the whir of servo drills and the clinical beeping of monitoring equipment. The thing about pain is that it becomes your entire universe. There's no room for thought, for planning, for hope or despair. There's only the sensation, consuming everything, reducing you to something less than human, just nerve endings firing, just a body in extremis. And then they triggered something in my brain, some implanted regulator, and the pain simply stopped. Not faded, stopped. One moment I was drowning in it, and the next I felt nothing at all. My body was distant, separate from my consciousness, a meat puppet that belonged to the tech priests now. When they removed me from the surgical frame, I could see through my left eye differently. The world had gained a layer of information I'd never perceived before. Temperature readings appeared in my peripheral vision. Distance measurements overlaid themselves on everything I looked at. I could see in spectrums beyond normal human perception the heat signatures of the servitors standing guard, the electromagnetic fields pulsing through the walls, the data streams flowing through the cables. It was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. The woman who had been crying in the processing chamber was in the recovery section with me, strapped to a Medicaid cot 3 spaces down. She wasn't crying anymore. Half her face had been replaced with a sensor array, the flesh around it still raw and weeping fluid. Her remaining human eye stared at nothing, and when she breathed, I could hear the mechanical wheeze of augmetic lung tissue synchronizing with what remained of her organic respiratory system. She died 2 days later. The tech priests harvested her organs efficiently, wasting nothing, and brought in a new subject for her cot. I didn't die. That's both my curse and what made me valuable to them. My body accepted the augmentation with minimal rejection. The eye integrated perfectly, forming neural connections faster than their models predicted. When they examined me on the 3rd day, I heard one tech priest say to another in Gothic, they used Gothic sometimes, for simple concepts that Binaric couldn't efficiently express, that I was remarkably compatible. The words meant nothing to me then. Later, I understood them as my death sentence. Because if you're compatible, they don't stop at one augmentation. The second procedure came on the 7th day. They took my left arm this time, detaching it at the shoulder with surgical precision. I watched them do it. They'd given me neural regulators that prevented me from looking away, kept my eyes locked forward while they worked. My augmetic eye recorded everything in perfect detail, storing it in the memory banks they'd implanted in my cerebral cortex. I can replay the memory even now if I choose to, can watch my arm being severed with the same clarity as if it were happening again. I choose not to, but the fact that I could is its own horror. The replacement was beautiful in the way only Mechanicus technology can be. Burnished steel and blessed ceramite, actuators powered by a micro-reactor that generated its own heat, fingers that could crush rockcrete or perform surgery with equal facility. They spent hours calibrating it, having me grasp objects of varying fragility, while they measured the force output and adjusted the sensitivity. I crushed 17 glasses before I could hold one without shattering it. The shards cut my remaining flesh hand when I tried to clean them up, and a junior tech adept scolded me for the inefficiency of bleeding on the laboratory floor. They called it a laboratory. I called it a butcher shop dressed in sacred oils and prayer. By the 14th day, I'd lost track of how much of me remained. My legs had been replaced with digitigrade augmetics that distributed weight more efficiently. 3 more neural implants created a mesh network in my skull, processing information faster than baseline human cognition allowed. My lungs were now synthetics, more efficient than flesh, requiring less oxygen and filtering toxins automatically. When I looked at myself in the polished chrome surface of the surgical frame, I saw something that might have been human once, wearing my face like an ill-fitting mask. The others in my processing group were dying or had died. Of the 17 who entered with me, Only 4 remained by the 3rd week. One had been reduced to a servitor after his nervous system rejected the augmentation. I saw him in the halls sometimes, shambling with that characteristic servitor gait, all his personality erased, replaced with simple subroutines. The woman they'd turned into a servitor still had her face, though her eyes were dead and empty. I wanted to know if she was still in there somewhere, still aware but unable to control her own body. I never found out. Questions weren't encouraged. The tech priest supervising my augmentation, I'd started thinking of it as mine, possessively. The way you might claim ownership of a particularly attentive torturer, began speaking to me occasionally. Not as a person speaks to another person, but as an engineer might muse aloud about a particularly interesting problem. It told me about rejection rates and compatibility thresholds, about the difficulty of maintaining neural cohesion during extensive augmentation, about the sacred quest to perfect the union of flesh and machine. Its voice was synthesized, stripped of emotion, but I detected something in its cadence that might have been enthusiasm, or perhaps I was projecting, desperate to find some humanity in my captors, even as they systematically stripped away my own. On day 23, they showed me what they were really studying. The holding chamber was deeper than the laboratories, accessed through a corridor that descended at a precise 15-degree angle for what felt like miles. The walls here were different, older, pre-Imperial stonework reinforced with more recent Mechanicus construction. The temperature dropped significantly as we descended, and frost formed on the exposed metal surfaces. My augmetic eye registered the temperature as -17 degrees standard, well below the tolerance range for unaugmented humans. But I was barely human anymore, so I didn't shiver. The chamber itself was circular, perhaps 50 meters across, ringed with observation stations and monitoring equipment. In the center, suspended in a cage of electromagnetic fields, was something that shouldn't have existed. It looked organic, but wrong flesh that had the texture of machine components, or perhaps machines that had somehow grown flesh. Cables and veins intertwined indistinguishably. Circuit patterns traced themselves across surfaces that pulsed like muscle tissue. Eyes opened and closed along its length, some human, some mechanical, some hybrid abominations that were neither and both. "Behold," the tech priest said, and for the first time its synthesized voice carried something approaching reverence. "The culmination, the sacred union." I stared at the thing, and felt my new augmetic systems, trying to process what I was seeing, running analysis routines that kept returning errors. My human brain recoiled from it, while my machine components found it fascinating, beautiful even. The conflict between these responses created a cognitive dissonance that manifested as physical nausea, my remaining organic systems rejecting what my augmetic parts embraced. "This is the goal," the tech priest continued. "True synthesis. Not mere augmentation, but complete integration. Flesh that thinks like machine, machine that grows like flesh. The Omnissiah's perfect creation." "What is it?" I managed to ask, my voice strange in my own ears. I had vocal augmentation now, could speak in frequencies beyond human hearing if needed. "Failed potential," another tech priest answered, emerging from an observation station. This one was more heavily augmented than my supervisor, barely a tenth of its body organic. It achieved synthesis, but lost coherence. It cannot direct itself, cannot maintain purpose. It simply exists, growing and incorporating whatever it touches. Magnificent biology. Useless application. They'd been trying to create it deliberately, I understood then. This wasn't an accident or a cautionary tale. This was an experiment that had succeeded too well, had gone beyond what they'd intended. And we, the subjects in the laboratories above, we were the next iteration, the refined version. They were testing augmentation limits, finding the threshold where human will could maintain control even as flesh became increasingly irrelevant. "How many?" I asked. "How many subjects before me?" The tech priest tilted its head, servo motors whirring. Quantification is irrelevant. Only success rates matter. Your compatibility is exceptional. You will help us understand the parameters. They took me back to the laboratories, and the procedures intensified. Where before they'd waited days between augmentations, allowing integration time, now they worked faster. My right arm joined my left in replacement. My digestive system was upgraded to process a wider range of materials. My skeletal structure was reinforced with ceramite struts. My skin received subdermal armor plating in critical areas. Each procedure brought me closer to the thing in the chamber, that writhing mass of hybrid horror, and each procedure taught the tech priests more about the boundaries of integration. I should have been horrified. Part of me was. But another part, growing larger with each augmentation, found the efficiency beautiful. My augmetic systems were superior to my original flesh in every measurable way. I was stronger, faster, more durable. My perception had expanded to senses humans weren't meant to possess. I could interface directly with machine systems, feeling data flow through my consciousness like thoughts. When I was connected to the laboratory's cogitator network, I could access information instantaneously, my mind expanding to fill the digital space. This, I realized, was how they broke you. Not through pain. Pain was temporary, just data. They broke you by making the augmentation seductive, by showing you the power and capability that came with surrendering your flesh. They made you complicit in your own transformation. By day 40, I was working, not being worked on working. The tech priests had me assisting with other subjects, using my unique perspective as someone who retained human cognition while possessing extensive augmentation. They wanted to know what integration felt like from the inside, wanted me to describe the sensation of nerve endings connecting to servo motors, of organic neural tissue interfacing with processing cores. I became a bridge between their clinical observations and the lived experience they couldn't access. The new subjects were terrified of me. I saw it in their eyes, the same fear I'd felt when I first saw the servitors. I'd become the thing that dragged people into nightmare. When I held them down during procedures, my augmetic strength ensuring they couldn't escape the restraints, I told myself I was being merciful, that my assistance made the process more efficient, reduced their suffering through clinical precision. But I knew the truth. I'd been assimilated, not into servitude, but into something worse, willing participation. There was another subject from my original group still alive. His name was Harkin, and he'd been augmented differently than me. Where they'd made me mobile and functional, they'd made him a living sensor array. His body was covered in detection equipment, every inch of his skin replaced with touch-sensitive monitoring gear, his eyes replaced with multi-spectrum analyzers, his ears with acoustic receptors that could hear through solid walls. They kept him in a sensory deprivation chamber between tests, because the flood of information overwhelmed him otherwise. When they needed him, they'd bring him out and position him near whatever they wanted analyzed, and he'd scream the entire time as his consciousness drowned in data. I helped them with Harkin. I monitored his vital signs during testing, adjusted his neural regulators when the sensory input threatened to destroy his sanity, recommended modifications to reduce his suffering while maintaining experimental utility. I told myself I was helping him, that without my intervention, they'd have pushed him past breaking and lost all the data, that I was extending his life, even if that life was agony. Harkin didn't see it that way. During one of his lucid moments, when the sensory deprivation had given him enough respite to think clearly, he looked at me with his augmetic eyes and said, "You've become one of them." I wanted to deny it, wanted to explain that I was surviving, adapting, making the best of an impossible situation. But the words caught in my throat, my augmetic throat, equipped with voxcasters and synthesizers, barely human anymore. He was right. Somewhere between the terror of the first procedure and the clinical efficiency of the 40th day, I'd crossed a line. I'd stopped being a victim and become a collaborator. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it just felt like data. Processed, categorized, filed away in my neural storage for later analysis. My emotions were becoming distant, muted by the machine systems integrating into my limbic functions. I could remember feeling things strongly, the love for my dead wife, the simple pleasure of recaf before shift, but the memories felt archived, like events that happened to someone else, someone human, someone I'd been before. Day 57. They took me back to the deep chamber. The thing in the electromagnetic cage had grown since my last visit, now nearly 20 meters across, a pulsing mass of integrated systems that defied categorization. New eyes had opened along its surface. I counted 37 visible from my position. Some tracked my movement. Others stared at nothing. Several appeared to be weeping, a fluid that looked like oil mixed with blood. Status? My supervising tech priest asked. I didn't question how I knew what it wanted. My augmentations had progressed to the point where I could interpret binary cant now, could feel the electromagnetic queries it transmitted and formulate responses without conscious thought. Integration stable. 87% of original organic tissue replaced or enhanced. Neural cohesion maintained at acceptable thresholds. No significant rejection episodes in the last 23 days. Query. Subjective assessment of consciousness continuity? This was the question they always came back to. The thing in the cage had lost itself somewhere in the integration process, had become pure biology without will or direction. They wanted to know if I could feel myself slipping, if there was a warning before the loss of self. Consciousness remains continuous, I reported. Identity persistence, verified through regular self-assessment protocols. Emotional effect significantly dampened, but memories of pre-augmentation identity remain accessible. Conclusion. I am still Talvin Cross, though diminished. The tech priest made a notation, manipulator arms dancing across its data slate. Diminished, it repeated. Quantify. How do you quantify the loss of humanity? How do you measure the distance between who you were and what you've become? I tried to formulate a response that would satisfy the tech priest's need for data while conveying the essential truth of my dissolution. 73% of baseline personality markers remain consistent with pre-augmentation baseline, I said finally. 27% variance, attributed to perspective shift resulting from enhanced capability and altered cognitive architecture. Acceptable variance, the tech priest judged. Proceed to next phase. The next phase. I should have been afraid, but fear required emotional investment, and my emotions were filing themselves away into increasingly distant storage. Instead, I felt curiosity. What could they possibly add that they hadn't already taken or replaced? They showed me the schematic in the laboratory. It was displayed on a hololithic projector, a three-dimensional blueprint of a human body, my body, specifically with proposed augmentations overlaid in crimson. The sheer scope of it took even my augmented processing several seconds to fully comprehend. Total conversion, the tech priest explained. Every remaining organic system upgraded or replaced. Your current configuration has proven the viability of extensive augmentation while maintaining consciousness continuity. The Omnissiah's wisdom suggests that complete conversion is achievable. What percentage organic? I asked. Final configuration. Approximately 3% organic tissue, primarily neural tissue, essential for consciousness generation, encased in armored housing. All other systems, mechanical. 3%. They were going to make me a machine with a human mind trapped inside it. A servitor, but conscious. A horror that would know exactly what it had become. And if I refuse? The question was automatic, a subroutine running from my diminishing human protocols. The tech priest tilted its head in that way they did when processing an unexpected query. Refusal is illogical. You have been selected, resources have been invested, data must be collected. Consent is not a factor in the Omnissiah's work. Of course. I'd known that since the first moment the servitors flanked me in Hab Block 447 Gamma. Consent had never been relevant. I was property now, a test subject, valuable only for the data my transformation generated. And the terrible thing was that part of me, the part that was already more machine than man, agreed with the logic. Refusing would waste resources. My transformation was generating valuable information about augmentation thresholds. The Mechanicus's research served the Imperium, and the Imperium was all that stood between humanity and the darkness between the stars. When did I start thinking like them? Compliance, I heard myself say. When do we begin? Immediately. The procedures that followed made everything before seem gentle. They weren't just adding augmentations anymore, they were systematically disassembling my body and rebuilding it as machine. My spine was extracted and replaced with an armored conduit housing redundant neural pathways. My organs were removed one by one, their functions assumed by mechanical systems that didn't require rest or nourishment. My muscles were stripped away and replaced with synthetic fibers powered by compact generators. My bones became reinforced ceramite superstructure. The pain was exquisite. They'd reduced my pain regulation now, needed me to feel it so they could monitor neural response during the conversion process. Each procedure pushed me to the edge of consciousness and held me there, wavering on the boundary between awareness and oblivion. I screamed, though my voice was entirely synthetic now, produced by voxcasters modulated to approximate human vocalization. The screams echoed in the laboratory, mixing with the whir of servo tools and the clinical beeping of monitoring equipment. Harkin died on day 63. His nervous system finally collapsed under the strain of constant sensory overload, his brain basically liquefying inside its skull casing. They extracted what they could for analysis, then disposed of the rest. I felt something when I learned about his death grief. Maybe, or perhaps just recognition that another connection to my human past had been severed. But the feeling was distant, processed through so many cognitive filters that it arrived at my consciousness as barely more than background data. I was alone then, the last survivor of my original processing group, the most extensively augmented test subject in the facility's current research cycle, the thing that walked around wearing Talvin Cross's memories like files in a storage drive. On day 70, they showed me what I'd become. The mirror was full length, polished chrome, set up in the laboratory where I'd undergone so many transformations. The tech priest led me to it without comment, curious to see my reaction. I stood before it and looked at myself, really looked for the first time since the conversion had intensified. I was beautiful. That was the first thought, and it came from my machine components, from the part of me that appreciated efficiency and optimal design. I was sleek and powerful, every line purposeful, every component perfectly integrated. Crimson robes hung from my shoulders, marked with the cogtooth symbol of the Mechanicus. My chassis was gunmetal gray and bronze, polished to a mirror shine in some places, matte and functional in others. Cables ran across my frame like arteries, pulsing with data light. My eyes, both mechanical now, the right having been upgraded to match the left, glowed with a soft amber light. I was monstrous. That was the second thought, and it came from whatever remained of Talvin Cross, the maintenance worker who'd once been human. I was a perversion of the human form, a mockery of what people were meant to be. I was exactly the kind of thing I would have fled from in terror if I'd seen it in the Factorum corridors before my selection. I was the thing that dragged people into nightmare and wore their faces as masks. Both thoughts were true. I was beautiful. I was monstrous, and I was still, impossibly, conscious, still aware, still me. however diminished and transformed. Subjective assessment, the tech priest prompted. What could I say? What words existed to describe this? I searched through my organic memories, trying to find language adequate to the moment, and found only fragments. The memory of my wife's face, the taste of recaf, the simple animal pleasure of breathing deeply, all archived, distant, belonging to someone else. Assessment. Transformation successful, I said finally, my Vox-synthesized voice flat and emotionless. Subject consciousness persists. Integration complete. Ready for function. Query. Identity continuity? The question every test subject dreaded. The one that determined whether you'd achieved synthesis or become the thing in the deep chamber, beautiful and growing and purposeless. I ran self-diagnostic protocols, compared my current thought patterns to archived baselines, analyzed decision-making processes for consistency with pre-augmentation personality. Identity persists, I confirmed. I am Talvin Cross. Designation, test, subject. 17, conversion cycle, Gamma 447. Status, functional. The tech priest made notation. I could see its satisfaction in the efficiency of its movements, the slight acceleration in its data recording. I'd given it what it wanted, proof that total conversion was possible while maintaining consciousness. I was the success it had been building toward through 17 processing groups and countless failed subjects. I was its masterpiece. They put me to work immediately. Not as a test subject anymore. I'd graduated from that role, but as an assistant in the ongoing research. My unique perspective, my ability to interface directly with machine systems while retaining human cognitive patterns, made me valuable in ways the tech priests themselves couldn't replicate. They might have been more augmented than me, but they'd undergone their transformations gradually over decades or centuries, had never experienced the brutal rapid conversion I'd survived. They couldn't counsel new subjects on what integration felt like because they'd never felt it the way I had. So I became what Harkin had accused me of being. I became one of them. New processing groups arrived. I watched them file into the chamber with that same incomprehension I'd felt, that same desperate hope that there must be some mistake. I saw their terror when they realized there was no mistake, no reprieve, no escape. And I helped process them. I held them down during procedures. I monitored their vitals. I made recommendations about augmentation sequences based on my own experience. I spoke to them in those moments of lucidity between procedures, telling them how to endure, how to surrender, how to let the machine take them piece by piece until there wasn't enough human left to hurt. Some of them accepted the transformation. These were the successes, the ones whose bodies adapted, who integrated the augmentations and maintained consciousness. They became like me, walking the laboratories in their new forms, learning to think with processors and feel with sensors. I trained them, taught them the sacred protocols of the Mechanicus, showed them how to see the beauty in the machine that had consumed their flesh. Most of them didn't accept it. These were the failures. They fought the augmentation, rejected it psychologically if not physically. Their minds broke under the strain of transformation, and what remained was either reduced to servitor programming or simply stopped functioning entirely. I watched them die or diminish, and felt nothing. Not pity, not grief, not even satisfaction. Just the clinical assessment of outcomes, the gathering of data, the refinement of process. I'd become what I'd feared. Not gradually, not through some single moment of conscious choice, but through 1,000 small compliances, 1,000 incremental surrenders. Each procedure had taken a piece of who I was and replaced it with something that worked better but felt less. And now there wasn't enough of me left to resist becoming the thing that fed others into the machine. On day 93, I went back to the deep chamber. The thing in the electromagnetic cage had grown massive now, filling half the chamber, tendrils of hybrid flesh machines spreading across the floor toward the walls. The tech priests were discussing containment procedures, debating whether to terminate it or continue observation. It had stopped growing eyes, I noticed. Instead, it had developed something like mouths, openings that formed and closed rhythmically, breathing or speaking, or maybe just existing without purpose. I stood before it and felt recognition. Not that I knew what it had been that information was lost or had never been recorded, but I recognized what it was now. It was the end point, the warning, the future that waited if integration went too far. It had achieved perfect synthesis and lost itself in the achievement. It was everything and nothing, powerful and purposeless, a masterpiece that couldn't appreciate its own perfection. I was scheduled for additional augmentation the next day. Further refinements to my processing capability, enhanced data storage, improved interface protocols. Nothing as dramatic as the initial conversion, just incremental improvements to an already successful design. The tech priests wanted to see how far they could push before I reached my limits. Standing there in the deep chamber, looking at the thing I might become, I made a decision. It was my first independent decision since the initial conversion. The first choice that came from something other than compliance or optimization protocols. I was going to escape, not because I wanted to reclaim my humanity that was gone, carved away piece by piece and replaced with blessed steel, not because I thought I could somehow undo what had been done. The procedures were irreversible. The man I'd been was archived and deleted, but because the part of me that was still Talvin Cross, however diminished, refused to become that thing in the cage, refused to surrender the last fragment of will that kept me aware, conscious, able to choose. The decision felt like data, cold and clinical, but it was mine. That mattered. Escaping from a Mechanicus research facility is theoretically impossible. The security is absolute, every entrance monitored, every corridor watched by servitors and automated defense systems. They designed the facility assuming their subjects would never resist, would either comply or break, would never retain enough coherent will to attempt flight. They'd made a mistake. They'd given me access to their systems, had trained me to interface with their networks, had shown me the facility's infrastructure because I needed that knowledge to assist with their work. They'd made me trusted, valuable, essential, and they'd forgotten that somewhere under the blessed steel and sacred circuitry, there was still a part of me that remembered being human enough to want escape. I waited until Deep Cycle, when the facility ran on minimal staff and automatic protocols. I interfaced with the security network and introduced an error, nothing obvious, just a small glitch in the monitoring system that created a gap in the observation coverage. 30 seconds. That's all I could generate without triggering alerts. 30 seconds to cross from the laboratory to the maintenance access tunnels. The tunnels were unmapped in the main facility schematics. I'd found them during data analysis, archived files from the original construction that showed service passages the current occupants had forgotten or considered irrelevant. They were narrow, barely adequate for my augmented frame, but they ran parallel to the main corridors and bypassed the security checkpoints. I moved through them in darkness, my augmetic eyes switching to infrared as I navigated by heat signatures and electromagnetic fields. Behind me, I could feel the facility's awareness turning toward my absence. Alarms hadn't sounded yet, but they would. Systems were noticing discrepancies, automated routines flagging the gap in observation data. Minutes, maybe less, before the tech priests understood what was happening. The tunnels ascended at a steep angle, following the facility's original engineering toward the surface. My augmetic legs handled the climb without effort, servos whining softly as they compensated for the grade. I passed junction points where the tunnels connected to main corridors, heard the sounds of the facility through the thin walls, the whir of machinery, the chanting of tech priests, the screams of subjects undergoing procedures. I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Each moment increased the likelihood of discovery, of servitors flooding the tunnels, of security protocols locking down every passage. I climbed faster, pushing my augmented body to its operational limits, feeling my systems heat up from the exertion even as cooling mechanisms struggled to compensate. The tunnel terminated at a maintenance access panel 3 levels above the laboratories. Beyond it should be Factorum level, the industrial complex where I'd once worked maintaining moisture recyclers, where I'd been nobody, just another maintenance worker, with a routine and a life measured in small comforts. Where I'd been human, I interfaced with the panel's lock, bypassed its security with the access codes I'd memorized from facility systems, and pushed it open. Cold air hit me, and with it came the smell of the Factorum oil and metal, and unwashed bodies and recycled air. Home, or what had been home before they took me. Alarms sounded behind me, echoing up through the tunnels. They'd discovered my absence. Security protocols were activating. Servitors would be mobilizing. Tech priests scrambling to lock down the facility. I had minutes at most before they caught me. I climbed out into the Factorum and found it deserted. Deep cycle meant skeleton shift, just enough workers to keep essential systems running. The industrial space stretched before me, familiar and foreign at once. I'd walked these corridors for 15 years, but that had been with human eyes, human legs, human limitations. Now I saw the Factorum in its totality: heat signatures from running machinery, electromagnetic fields from power distribution, structural stress points in the ceiling, air current patterns, temperature gradients. Information flooded my consciousness, overwhelming and clarifying simultaneously. Behind me, I heard the sounds of pursuit. Servitor footsteps, mechanical and precise. Binary, cant transmitted through the air. Tech priests coordinating their search. They were close, too close. I ran. My augmetic legs could achieve speeds no unaugmented human could match. Servos driving me forward in a blur of motion that ate up the corridor distance. Workers saw me and fled, their terror visible in their heat signatures and heart rate elevations. I must have been nightmare to them, a thing of metal and menace, fleeing through their workspace like some daemon from the warp. The Factorum connected to the underhive through cargo lifts and personnel access corridors. If I could reach them, I could lose myself in the vast habitation zones below, could disappear into the teeming masses, where even the Mechanicus's search protocols would be challenged. The underhive swallowed people, made them vanish into its depths. I could become nobody again, just another augmented worker among millions, unremarkable except to those who looked too closely. The personnel corridor was ahead, marked by familiar Imperial signage that I'd passed 10,000 times during my shifts. I ran toward it, systems screaming warnings about overexertion, heat buildup approaching critical thresholds. Behind me, servitors were gaining, their tireless mechanical bodies requiring no rest or recovery. I could hear their footsteps, precisely synchronized, closing the distance. I reached the corridor entrance and triggered the access door. It opened with mechanical precision, and beyond it, I could see the lift platform that would carry me down to the underhive. Safety, escape, survival. A tech priest stepped from a side passage, blocking my path. It was my supervisor, the one who'd overseen my transformation, guided me through 73 days of conversion. Its augmetic eyes regarded me without emotion, processing equipment whirring as it analyzed my presence. Subject 17, it said, its synthesized voice flat. This is unexpected behavior. Analysis suggests severe cognitive deviation from established patterns. I stopped, unable to pass without confronting it. My augmented body could overwhelm it physically. I was built for functionality, while tech priests were built for analysis and prayer. But something in me hesitated. This was the thing that had made me what I was, had guided my transformation, had shown me the beauty in the machine even as it destroyed my humanity. I'm leaving, I said, my voxcasters translating the decision into words. Negative, the tech priest responded. You are valuable. Resources have been invested. Your data is incomplete. Departure compromises research integrity. I don't care. The tech priest tilted its head. Query. Basis for resistance? You have achieved optimal configuration. Pain has been eliminated. Limitations have been exceeded. You have transcended human weakness. Logical analysis suggests compliance is preferable to flight. It was right. By any objective measure, I was superior to what I'd been. Stronger, faster, more capable. I would never again know hunger, or thirst, or exhaustion. Never again suffer the indignities of human flesh, the vulnerability of organic systems. I'd been granted the Omnissiah's blessing, elevated beyond the weakness that plagued baseline humanity. And yet, I remember being human, I said. Not just the archive of memories, I remember what it felt like. The taste of recaf, my wife's face, the weight of exhaustion that meant another day survived. You took all of that and made it data, made it distant and archived, but you couldn't erase it completely. Somewhere in all this blessed steel, there's still enough of Talvin Cross to want something you can't program into me. Specify desire, choice, I said. The right to choose my own diminishment. You're going to take me further, add more augmentation, refine me until there's nothing left but machinery that thinks it's human. I've seen what that becomes. The thing in the deep chamber, perfect synthesis, complete integration, and utterly purposeless. I'd rather die than become that. The tech priest processed this for several seconds, its systems running analysis protocols I could partially interpret through my own augmentations. Assessment, emotional response, it concluded, illogical but persistent. You cannot be permitted to depart. You are property of the Omnissiah. You will be recovered. Servitors were entering the corridor behind me now, forming a perimeter, cutting off retreat. The tech priest raised a manipulator arm, readying some tool or weapon I couldn't identify. This was the moment. Either I surrendered, returned to the laboratories, continued the transformation until nothing remained, or I fought. I chose violence. My augmented body moved faster than the tech priest's analysis protocols could track. I covered the distance between us in microseconds, my metal fist driving into its central processor housing with enough force to crush the blessed circuitry within. The tech priest made a sound, not pain. Machines don't feel pain, but perhaps surprise that I'd overcome my programming enough to resist. It collapsed, systems failing, and I vaulted over its body toward the lift platform. Servitors were converging, their dead eyes tracking me with mechanical precision. I reached the lift controls and triggered the descent protocol, the platform beginning its slow journey downward toward the underhive. A servitor reached me just as the platform started to move, its augmetic hand grasping my shoulder with crushing force. I grabbed it, used my superior strength to tear its arm from its socket, threw the appendage aside even as other servitors crowded the lift entrance. The platform continued its descent, pulling away from them, their reaching hands falling short. I stood on the descending platform and watched the Factorum rise above me, watched the servitors at the edge staring down with empty eyes, watched the lights of the level recede into darkness. Behind and above me, alarms were screaming, tech priests were mobilizing, search protocols were being activated. But for this moment, I was free, falling into the underhive's darkness, but falling of my own choice. The lift reached the underhive after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The platform emerged into a habitation sector I didn't recognize. All underhive sectors look similar, recycled architecture, repeated endlessly across the levels. Narrow corridors, dim lighting, the smell of humanity packed together too tightly. Living in spaces never meant to house so many. My augmetic senses picked up thousands of heat signatures in the immediate vicinity. bodies pressed into habs and workspaces and communal areas. I stepped off the platform and tried to blend into the crowds. It was impossible, of course. I was too obviously augmented, too clearly Mechanicus construction. People saw me and fled or froze, their fear palpable in their elevated heart rates and stress hormone signatures. I was the thing that didn't belong, the monster from the levels above, walking among them wearing stolen flesh over mechanical bones. But the underhive was vast, and even the Mechanicus's reach had limits. If I could find somewhere to hide, to wait until the immediate search passed, I might survive. Not as Talvin Cross, that person was dead, archived, gone, but as whatever I'd become, this hybrid thing that retained enough humanity to want escape even if it couldn't reclaim its humanity. I moved through the corridors, heading deeper into the level's interior, away from the major transit points where Mechanicus forces would search first. The architecture closed in around me, the ceiling lowering until even my augmented form had to duck beneath support beams. The people here were the poorest of the poor, the ones who lived in the spaces other citizens avoided. They watched me pass with wary eyes, but didn't flee. Down here, monsters were just another part of life. I found a maintenance space, old habit, drawing me to the familiar, and wedged myself inside. The space was barely adequate for my frame, cramped and dark and smelling of mold and rot, but it was shelter, and shelter was all I needed. My augmented body didn't require comfort, didn't require much of anything except occasional maintenance and power, and my internal generators handled the latter automatically. I sat in the darkness and ran self-diagnostic protocols, assessing the damage from my flight. Minor coolant leak in my left leg, stress fracture in my right arm's primary actuator, processing overheat in my neural mesh from the exertion and violence. Nothing critical, all within my system's auto-repair capacity. I would heal, or what passed for healing when your body was machinery. And then what? That was the question I hadn't answered, the problem I'd been fleeing toward without considering what came after escape. I couldn't return to my old life. That life required humanity I no longer possessed. Couldn't seek help from Imperial authorities. I was Mechanicus property, and the Imperium protected its institutions absolutely. Couldn't even die properly, not with my augmented body sustaining itself automatically, refusing to shut down even if I willed it. I was trapped, not in the laboratories, but in this body, this form, this existence that wouldn't release me. The tech priests had been right about one thing: I'd transcended human weakness, but they'd been wrong about what that meant. I hadn't become something superior. I'd become something that couldn't die even when life had become unbearable. Days passed in the maintenance space. My internal chronometer tracked them precisely 73 hours, 12 minutes, 47 seconds, since escape. Above me, I could feel the electromagnetic signatures of search protocols, Mechanicus teams moving through the levels, servitors scanning for my unique augmetic signature. They were systematic, thorough, tireless. Eventually they would search every maintenance space, every hab, every corridor. Eventually they would find me. On the fourth day, someone found me first. Not Mechanicus, someone human, or mostly human. A scavenger, judging by the tools and the desperate hunger in their heat signature. They'd seen me enter the maintenance space and had waited, hoping I'd die or leave, hoping they could salvage my augmetics for sale on the underhive black market. Emperor's mercy, they whispered, when they saw me still functional, still aware. You're alive. Alive, I agreed, my voxcaster making the word sound hollow. Is that what this is? They stared at me, confusion and fear warring in their expression. You're one of them Mechanicus things. What you doing down here? Shouldn't you be up in the Factorum, serving the machine god? I escaped, I said. Or tried to. They're hunting me. Why'd you run? They made you better than us meat folks. You're strong, can't get sick, can't age. You got it good. Did I have it good? The question was absurd. But from the scavenger's perspective, from the position of someone living in squalor and desperation, maybe augmentation looked like blessing. They couldn't see what I'd lost, only what I'd gained. Couldn't understand that strength without choice, immortality without purpose, capability without humanity, these were curses disguised as gifts. They're coming, I said, detecting increased search activity in the electromagnetic spectrum. You should leave before they arrive. The scavenger didn't move. What are you gonna do? What was I going to do? I'd been running on desperation and the fading momentum of that one moment of choice, but I'd never planned beyond escape, never considered whether survival without humanity was worth the effort, never questioned whether fleeing the laboratories only to hide in darkness was really any different from the cage I'd left. I don't know, I admitted, and the honesty felt strange, unprocessed by the usual filters and protocols. I thought escape mattered, thought choosing my own fate would mean something, but I'm still what they made me, still trapped in this body, still wearing this consciousness like a death sentence. Then why run? Because somewhere under the blessed steel and sacred circuitry, a fragment of Talvin Cross had refused to surrender completely, had insisted on making one choice, taking one action that originated from will rather than programming. Even if it was ultimately meaningless, even if it changed nothing, it had been mine. Because I had to, I said finally. Because the alternative was becoming something that couldn't even ask the question. The scavenger nodded slowly, processing this in whatever limited way their unaugmented mind could. That's something, I guess. More than most folks down here can say. We don't get choices. We just survive, or we don't. Search activity spiked. They were close now, maybe minutes away. Soon servitors would flood the maintenance spaces, and my unique signature would lead them directly to my location. This moment of strange communion with a desperate scavenger would end, and I'd be recovered, returned, refined, until nothing remained. Unless, I need you to do something for me, I said, my processors racing through scenarios, calculating probabilities, finding the one path that might give meaning to my flight. There's a chamber, deep below the factorum levels, accessed through corridors marked with restricted Mechanicus signage. Inside it, suspended in electromagnetic fields, there's something alive, something that used to be someone. What's that got to do with me? Tell people about it. Tell them what the Mechanicus does in their laboratories. Tell them about the test subjects, the forced augmentation, the experiments that turn people into monsters. Tell them that they don't ask, don't explain, just take whoever they want and remake them. Make sure the story spreads. The scavenger's eyes widened. They'd kill me for speaking such things. That's tech heresy, or regular heresy, or some kinda heresy that gets you burned. Probably, I agreed. But if you don't tell it, if the story dies with me, then what was the point? All those people they took, all those processing groups, all that suffering, it just disappears into their data archives, forgotten, meaningless. Someone has to witness, someone has to remember that we were people once, before they made us into sacred machines. Footsteps above us. Servitor pattern, precise and mechanical. The search teams had reached this level. Seconds now, not minutes. Go. I told the scavenger. Run. Remember. Tell. They fled, and I waited in the darkness, listening to the servitors approach. My systems were calm, all the panic subroutines deactivated now that decision had been made. I'd done what I could, made my choice, told my story to the only witness available. It wasn't much, wasn't remotely adequate to the horror of what I'd experienced, but it was something. The servitors found me. They pulled me from the maintenance space with mechanical efficiency, their dead eyes staring through me the way they'd stared through me on that first day in Hab Block 447 Gamma. I didn't resist. There wasn't any point. You can't fight the Mechanicus forever. Eventually the machine reclaims its property. They took me back to the facility, down the corridors I'd climbed, past the junction points I'd navigated, through the security checkpoints I'd bypassed, every step retracing my flight, returning me to the place I'd tried to escape. The laboratories were exactly as I'd left them, clinical, cold, smelling of sacred oils and organic decay. Nothing had changed except me. And I'd changed only to discover that change was irrelevant. My supervisor was waiting, its central processor housing repaired, systems functional again despite my assault. It regarded me with its augmetic eyes, processing my return, updating its data models. Subject 17, it said. Analysis indicates significant cognitive deviation. Recommendation: increased neural regulation to prevent future resistance. Your consciousness persists, but has proven unreliable. Further refinement is required. They strapped me to the surgical frame, the same frame where I'd undergone my first procedure, where I'd counted sealing rivets while they opened my skull. 243 rivets, perfectly aligned. I could still count them, could still access that archived memory of being terrified and human and whole. The refinement will be extensive, my supervisor continued. We will isolate the cognitive elements that generated resistance, implement additional control protocols, ensure complete compliance with operational parameters. You will retain consciousness that remains valuable to our research, but you will no longer experience the deficiencies that prompted your flight. You will achieve perfect synthesis. Perfect synthesis. Like the thing in the deep chamber, beautiful and purposeless and lost. That was my future, the fate I'd briefly delayed, but never really escaped. They would take the last fragments of Talvin Cross and archive them, would refine my consciousness until nothing remained that could resist or choose or want anything except what they programmed into me. I should have been terrified, should have been screaming, fighting, desperate in these final moments before they took even the capacity for desperation. But I felt only a strange calm, a distant satisfaction, because somewhere in the underhive, a scavenger was telling my story. The details would get twisted, exaggerated, mixed with other tales and urban legends, but the core truth would persist, that the Mechanicus took people against their will, remade them as machines, and one of them had run, had chosen, had insisted that consciousness mattered even when consciousness had become torture. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The procedures began. I felt them at first, the incisions, the invasions, the systematic dismantling of everything that remained human in my neural architecture. But then the regulators activated, and sensation became distant, irrelevant, just data being processed and filed. My consciousness persisted, aware but unable to resist, watching my own refinement with clinical detachment. They were thorough. They always were. The Mechanicus doesn't make mistakes, they make calculations. And I was the calculation that had proven problematic, that had demonstrated the flaw in their methodology. They wouldn't let that flaw persist. They would iterate, refine, perfect, and when they were done, I would be exactly what they'd wanted from the beginning, a consciousness that maintained coherence through total conversion, that could guide other subjects, that could demonstrate the beauty of the machine's triumph over flesh. I would be perfect. I would be purposeless. I would be the thing I'd feared. But for just a moment, in a maintenance space in the underhive, I'd been something else. I'd been Talvin Cross, making a choice, telling a story, insisting that I mattered even when I didn't, even when I couldn't, even when the inevitable grind of the Mechanicus's machinery would erase every trace of that insistence. The procedures continued. My consciousness began to fragment, pieces of personality being isolated and regulated and controlled. I could feel myself diminishing, not in capability but in essence, the last scraps of will being archived and deleted. Soon there would be nothing left but function, nothing but compliance, nothing but the perfect synthesis they'd been building toward. Above me, the ceiling rivets stared down. 243, perfectly aligned. The last thing Talvin Cross sees before he stops being anything at all. And in the Underhive, a scavenger tells a story about the thing that ran from the Mechanicus. The details are already changing, becoming legend, becoming myth. But the truth persists underneath, that someone tried, that someone chose, that someone insisted their consciousness mattered even when the machine said otherwise. It isn't much, but it's something. The last thing I remember thinking, before the final regulator activates and I become perfect, we were people once. We were people. We were.